Hello Internet, this is BearPunchMagic, and today we are going to be talking about Edric Spymaster of Trest. We are going to start by taking a look at Edric himself. For 1, a green and a blue mana, so 3 mana total. You get a 2/2 legendary creature, Elf Rogue, who says, whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may draw a card. As we all know, drawing Magic cards is the coolest thing a Magic player can do in a game of Magic. So we are really going to be leaning in and trying to capitalize on Edric's just insane card draw potential. A quick note about Edric's ability is that there are going to be plenty of times where your opponents are also going to be able to draw cards off of Edric. We're generally going to be okay with this though, because it means your opponents are attacking each other. And if they're attacking each other, they're not attacking you. So just keep in mind that you can use this ability as a political tool against the table. So the game plan for this deck is pretty simple and straightforward. Step 1, we're going to play creatures that are hard to block. Step 2, we are going to turn those creatures sideways. Step 3, we're going to draw a bunch of cards. And finally, step 4, we are going to repeat this process until all of your opponents are dead. So while we are trying to play a bunch of creatures that are hard to block, we are also trying to play creatures that are hard to block that have low mana costs. The more creatures we can play in a single turn, or over the course of a turn cycle, the more creatures we're going to be able to attack with, and the more creatures we attack with, the more cards we draw. Unfortunately, this means some of the more powerful evasive threats, cards like Aetherling or Kaiga the Tidestar, are just too expensive mana cost wise to really fit nicely into this deck. You can still play them if you really want to, but generally speaking, you're going to see more success with just a bunch of smaller, low-costed creatures. So the best form of evasion is simply just the text is unblockable, or more recently, can't be blocked. Cards like Slitherblade, Mistcloaked Herald, Invisible Stalker, Jessian Infiltrator all fit into this category. And because these creatures are unblockable, you are always going to have an open attack target. And if you can hit somebody in the face, again, we get to draw cards. And that's awesome. While it's not going to be as good as just can't be blocked, flying is still a good form of evasion that's going to get your creatures through most of the time. And there are plenty of really good creatures we can play in the 1 and 2 drop slot that have flying. Cards like Fairy Seer, which when it enters the battlefield you get to scry 2. Icefang Codal, just straight up draws you a card. And most importantly, Stormcrow. There are also plenty of really good cards that have conditional forms of evasion, cards like Spire Tracer and Signal Pest, each which can only be blocked by a creature with Flying Reach, or Gingerbrute, which by paying a generic mana, can only be blocked by creatures with haste. It's also good to make sure you include a few cards that can grant evasion to your creatures. Sometimes you have creatures that do not have evasion, like Mana Dorks or Edric, or your opponent maybe has some flying creatures that you really need to get around. So cards like Aqueous Form, which just means it can't be blocked, Invisibility, which means it can only be blocked by creatures with Defender, or Tetsuko Umezawa gives most of your creatures in this deck, if they do not already have unblockable, it makes them unblockable. Edric's ability to draw cards is very crucial to this deck's success, so if we're unable to get him to stay on the battlefield, the deck just doesn't work. There are several ways in the deck that we can kind of emulate his ability, with cards like Bident of Thassa, Reconnaissance Mission, and Coastal Piracy all doing effectively the same job as Edric. Because we're playing a creature-heavy deck, we get to play some cards like Guardian Project, Beast Whisperer, Lifecrafter's Bestiary, all of these cards that just reward us for playing creatures. And if we get to draw more cards, we get to play more creatures, which lets us draw more cards, which is play more creatures, and then we attack with those creatures to draw more cards. Because we've established that this deck is going to be drawing a lot of cards, there should be a few payoff cards just simply rewarding you for drawing the cards. Words of Wilding, you can pay a mana instead of drawing the card, and you get a 2/2 bear. Now while you don't get the card in your hand, you do get a bear, and that's pretty good. And the Deer Kraken is another similar card. Whenever you draw a card, you can pay a mana, put a +1/+1 counter on the Kraken, and you get to make a tentacle. It's not as good as the bear, but it is an extra creature. There's also Roulette Monvuli Recluse, who whenever you draw your second card each turn, you get to make a 2/2 cat. And while you only get to effectively make one creature per turn, this one is free. Now keep Roulette in mind because we're going to talk about her again in just a minute. Your ramp should probably skew more towards creature-based ramp cards like Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, that sort of creature. Simply because late in the game, when you don't need the ramp, it is an extra body that you can attack with. That being said, including a few artifact or land ramp cards is always going to be good in case of a board wipe that you cannot stop. Speaking of board wipes, they can really slow this deck down. Now granted, the curve is relatively low, so rebuilding is a lot easier than it would be in some other decks, but it's still a hindrance. Now because we're playing blue, we do have access to counterspells. And you can choose your own counterspell kit however you want to, but there were a couple of specific cards that I felt were worth mentioning. First of all is Rights of Refusal. So it says, discard any number of cards from your hand. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3 mana for each card discarded this way. Now, if you don't discard any cards, it doesn't do anything. If you discard one card, it's a mana leak. But, because this deck should be drawing a lot of cards, and have access to redundant cards in hand, you can afford to discard multiple cards and turn it into a super mana leak, at which point you should be able to just counter the spell outright. The other specific card that I wanted to bring up was Admiral's Order. So for 1 blue it says counter target spell. However, it has raid, which means if you attacked with a creature this turn, you may pay a blue mana rather than pay the spell's mana cost. We are going to be attacking almost every turn, so we should almost always have raid active. Heroic Intervention is another good protection spell against board wipes, or even spot removal if really necessary. Shaper's Sanctuary is another kind of protection spell. It doesn't necessarily protect your creatures from being destroyed, but it does disincentivize your opponents from targeting your creatures. Kira Greatglass Spinner is another really good protection option for the deck. Not only does it counter the first spell or ability that targets any of your creatures each turn, but it's also just a low-costed flyer. So blue and green's removal suite is kind of weird. Green's removal tends to be in the form of fighting other creatures, or not being able to deal with creatures at all. And this is not a deck where fighting creatures works out very well for you. Now fortunately, we do have access to cards like Pongify, Rapid Hybridization, and Beast Within, all of which destroy the thing and turn it into another thing. And then of course, Oko Thief of Crowns, which just turns it into something else. Now while our spot removal might be a little on the jankier side, we do have access to one of the best board wipes, if not the best board wipe in Commander, and that is Cyclonic Rift. If you don't want to play that, you have options like Crush of Tentacles, River's Rebuke, and Devastation Tide. All of them are going to do effectively the same job, but they are not going to be nearly as good. Now if the deck is working properly, we should have lots of little unblockable creatures out on the battlefield and lots of cards in hand, but eventually we're going to have to figure out how to actually close the game out. Scale Up is a great option, as it turns all of your creatures into 6/4 worms, while keeping their evasive abilities intact. So now instead of hitting them with, say, 6/1/1s that are unblockable, you're now hitting them with 6 6/4s that are unblockable. Roulette Monvuli Recluse, again, does the very similar effect, based on the number of cards in your hand. As we've established, we should have a lot of cards in hand, so Roulette can also make your creatures very, very big. Return of the Wild Speaker, Endray's Forerunners, and just the generic Overrun itself, all can give your creatures a small power boost, and while it might not be nearly as dramatic as, say, a Scale Up or a Roulette activation, if you've been chipping away at your opponents this entire game, it might still be enough to just close out a game right there. As far as the lands are concerned, just use whatever dual lands your budget allows for. The more dual lands you have access to, typically the more consistent you're going to have your colors, but otherwise, I wouldn't be too stressed about it. I would recommend using the snow-covered basics if you have them or have access to them, simply because Icefang Codal is a magic card. And while you don't need to have the Death Touch portion of it activated, if you're playing the snow-covered basics, it's free. Reliquary Tower is really good in this deck, because we like to have a lot of cards in hand. When we look at cards like Jewel Royale, which cares about how many cards we have in hand, not having to discard all of them and being able to sink all of that mana into her never hurts. Rogue's Passage is just another way to guarantee another creature getting through. And then the last land I really wanted to talk about was Fairy Conclave, simply because it turns itself into a flying creature. So if you have the mana available, you can turn that mana into an extra card. Edric might not be the most powerful commander out there, but it is one of the most fun. You get to draw a lot of cards, you get to play a lot of creatures, you get to draw a lot of cards, you get to attack with a lot of creatures, you get to draw a lot of cards. And one of the cool things about this deck is that it is relatively budget friendly. Most of the really good synergistic cards in this deck are just commons and uncommons, so you're not really out a whole lot of money. And if you do have more of a budget, you can put that money towards your lands or some of the better cards like Craterhoof Behemoth. Additionally, this is also a really good deck for newer players to Magic, or just newer players to Commander in general, because the game plan is really straightforward, doesn't do a whole lot of complicated, crazy combos or anything like that. You're just turning cards sideways and having a good time. That's all I have to say about Edric Spymaster of Trest. Thank you for watching.